Hey everybody, this is Ibarionex from the Candid Frame. Welcome. Before we start talking about pictures and the topic for the week, I want to let you know that I'm going to be participating in Street Week in LA. It's a photography festival, or more accurately, a street photography festival that's held each year in Los Angeles, and it's hosted and coordinated by the Los Angeles Center for Photography, where I teach a couple of classes each year. They're going to be doing a whole host of events. They're going to be having speakers each night during the week, a photo walk, a workshop. Nick Turpin, formerly of In Public, is teaching a workshop. I don't know if there's still spaces available for that, but you can find out about that and a whole lot more by visiting the LACP website at lacphoto.org. And I think there are a couple of slots for my half-day workshop being held in February. So if you're interested in studying with me, sign up for that. Now, one of the things that I always am looking for in a street photograph, especially when I'm looking at Flickr, I'm looking at Instagram, is a rich image, a complex image. A lot of pictures are very simple. You have a subject and you have a background. And in thinking of an analogy, when you have a really good meal, what really usually happens with a really good dish is that when you taste it, it's not just that you are tasting one or two flavors. There are usually a variety of flavors that play in your mouth, and there's also the texture of the food that you're eating. And all of those things, including the smell, the way the meal looks, all of that plays a role in your enjoyment of whatever that you're eating. And I think that in terms of photography, what we want to have is just as rich and fulfilling an experience. We just don't want a singular element in the shot and have that be all that's there. Sometimes a simple shot can be amazing. Sometimes simplicity is the best choice. But I find that increasingly, for myself at least, I want pictures that allow me to linger, that allow me to explore what's happening in the frame and discover nuances, subtle things that make the experience that much more enjoyable, in this case, the photograph. So we have several images here that we're going to look at, and let's talk about it. Okay, here we have a shot by Bjarne Erick. This was made with a Fujifilm X100T at 1/30th of a second, f2, ISO 640. Now, as you well know, in street photography, we have a lot of photographs of people walking down the street. And this is slightly different. This woman is actually running through the scene here, but it's pretty much playing on that familiar motif of someone moving down a public street. But what makes this shot really interesting and so enjoyable for me is a lot of other things that are at play. In terms of her, she's great. She's beautifully dressed. She's got that beautiful coat on. She has the hat. She has the earrings. She has the pants, the boots. She's really well done up in this location, wherever it is. And then you have this wonderful light that's hitting her, and she has this great expression on her face. We have the display of the legs. All of that is great. And it really captures a really wonderful moment as this woman is moving through the scene. But there's so much other stuff that's at play here that's making the shot interesting. The choice to go with a slow shutter speed and panning with her as she moves through the scene renders her relatively sharp, but creates a slight blur and a streaking effect for all the other elements in the background. They're not relegated to just being static, and that really creates a nice visual contrast between her sharpness and sort of the blur shakiness of all the other elements in the frame. Then you also have the difference in terms of the color temperature. The light that's illuminating her is a lot warmer as compared to the light in the background. I'm going to assume that this is just at dusk, and some sort of artificial light source is illuminating her as she moves from left to right. And that difference, that contrast between warm and cool, create a nice color contrast, as well as, the kind of light and dark contrast you're accustomed to seeing. We have the figure on the left, which I assume is someone who is with her, because both of their expressions give off a sense of joy and happiness. And I assume that they're both reacting to the same thing, even though we don't see it because it's out of frame. But having him there is a nice sort of counterpoint to him, even though he is largely relegated to shadow and he hasn't walked into the light that she's walked into. We still get a sense of his presence there, his expression, which is really nice. I like having more than just a single figure there. I think if she were just alone, it would be a wonderful image, but having someone else there, I think, helps. Then we have the little, details of color that are happening here. The more obvious one is the green bike that's right behind her, but there are also the streaks of light from what appear to be cars and trucks in the distance. I love that those things exist there, just as little splashes of color, not to the point that they're distracting, but they just add a little accent to her, and to the overall frame. And this is what I'm talking about: complexity, richness. All of these details beyond her are very small secondary elements, but they play off of her and the moment in a really sort of beautiful way that when you take a look at this picture, you're always discovering something new and different. And that's the kind of photograph that I increasingly gravitate to, and that I attempt myself as a photographer to try and create. It's very difficult. It's not easy. But when you produce an image like this, man, it really pays off. All right, here we have a shot by Dean Forbes. This was created with the Fujifilm X-T3 at 1/800th of a second, f5.6, ISO 200. Now, here we have this fellow who's standing here on what I assume is a sidewalk, and he's just sort of standing there. And you have a really interesting play of light on him. His face is largely relegated to almost silhouette against that board of wood that's behind him. So his head, the outline of his features are really cleanly defined, as is his body and his arms. And that in and of itself is sort of an interesting element of the shot. But what makes it interesting for me, even though he isn't doing anything particularly interesting in this moment, it's not like the previous shot where the woman where she is dynamically moving through the frame. He's just standing there observing something, waiting for something. But it's how he plays off the graphic elements that are in this scene, along with the play of light and shadow that not only sort of plays with how he's rendered in the frame, but you also see it at the top here of this tarp. You see this shadow here. You see this piece of wood that's leaning against the wall, creating a defined shadow there. You see the shadows of leaves and branches of a tree in the upper left-hand corner, as well as here, another piece of wood or something in the lower left-hand corner. So you have light and shadow that are really a big part of the overall feel and look of the image because of the high contrast light in which it's being photographed in. But then there's also these shapes and lines that are everywhere in the shot. One of the obvious lines is obviously this, or shape is this circle of the sign that indicates that you shouldn't be parking there, and the red diagonal stripe that goes through the P. But you also have these horizontal lines that are repeated throughout the frame, as well as vertical lines. You see the lines here, the pole, and we have these vertical and horizontal lines here, and then we also have this diagonal here, this obvious diagonal here, but also diagonals implied by just his arm. There's a repetition of line and shape and shadow and even color in terms of the blues. We have variations of red. There's a singular patch of yellow here, but we also see some dark blacks throughout the frame. And all of these things are really small individual elements that might not be important if they were just isolated by themselves for the purpose of a photograph or a composition. But by combining those elements carefully within the frame, it creates a really nice and pleasing looking photograph. And like the previous image, I'm looking at this and really appreciating the small little details there. I see like this round circle here that's partially cut off, and I start thinking, oh, where are more circles? And other than this circle, I see there's another circle here. Maybe pulling back would have revealed, a pattern of circles that isn't immediately obvious. But this image pulls me in a way that allows me to really kind of examine it and see what more is there. And as I look at it even more, I'm noticing the texture of the wall, the texture of the tarp here. When you don't take a look at an image literally and just say, oh, this is just a street scene with a guy standing there, when you examine it in terms of the light and the shadow, the line and the shape and the color, you see how much richness is available to you. And if you slow down when you're out there photographing and you're really careful to observe a scene, you may discover that there are scenes just like that where you can leverage those graphic elements to produce a really strong shot. Now, this is a scene that for me would be worth lingering on, because as much as this guy is an interesting element here, just standing there, I wonder if if Dean here had been there for a while, might there have been people walking through the scene? I don't know exactly what the logistics of this were, whether there was any foot traffic there. But to my mind, when I see a scene like this with so much visual potential, and I have all those graphic elements just sitting there, what I'm waiting for is the gesture, for that little telling flourish of a body, of a head, of a movement that adds something even more that's completely unpredictable and something you can't really anticipate until the moment it reveals itself. When you find a scene like this with so much potential and there is foot traffic happening, man, it really pays off to wait. Here we have a shot by Jeff Williams. This was created with a Nikon D800 at 640th of a second, f4, ISO 1600. Now here's an image where there are some graphic elements. There's some repeating lines and shapes and colors that are all over this frame. And you actually have different shots within this frame. You have the woman here who's on, I guess, this exercise machine or this child's plaything on in the park, and I just love how her body and the color of her outfit and her shape of her hat play off of this thing element here, and having this kid within the frame. That in itself is one moment. And then we have another moment here with these other kids and these two men that are at play with these kids, and there's a whole another moment happening there. And then we have another moment happening here with this kid with the ball and him about to lean out of the frame. So there are all these different moments that are happening simultaneously that for me play off of each other really nicely. There are some connective things in terms of color because each of those moments is exhibited by the color blue, and to some extent a little bit of red in each frame. So you can see here with the red ball, the red part of this girl's top, the red stripe here, the red shoe, the obvious blue that repeats itself. And even though these are disparate moments or elements that are happening to each other, the color blue serves as a sort of connective tissue between all of these things, even though the actions are slightly different. Now, another thing that's happening is in terms of implied lines. We always talk about horizontals and verticals and diagonals and shapes and all that. But here's an interesting sort of implied diagonal that happens throughout the frame. The obvious lines and shapes of these I don't even know what to call them, but these contraptions that are in this park give very definitive lines and shapes. So I'm not going to talk about those, but look at the implied diagonals that link all these three moments. We have this diagonal, this woman, and the way that she's leaning in here, right? Then we have this kid here who's leaning back as he grasps this wheel here. We also have this diagonal, this girl's arm, and we also have this slight diagonal of this boy who's sort of leaning forward as if he's going to fall onto the ball on the right hand side of the frame. And when you see the obvious moment here in terms of the activity, and you think, oh, this is really interesting, but what holds the image together is its graphic nature, the colors, the lines, the shapes, and the repetition of those elements throughout the entire frame. Because we see plenty of shots where you have an interesting subject doing something that's very engaging within the frame, and you have a bunch of other people in the shot, but they don't necessarily add anything to the overall composition. If anything, they end up being a distraction because they're not reinforcing what is at the heart of the photograph. There's just something that ends up pulling your attention away from the main action and weakens the overall composition. And I don't feel that at all looking at this frame. I certainly don't like that white car in the upper left-hand corner. And if you've heard me enough, you know how much I hate white cars because of the distraction that they provide. But in this case, it doesn't ruin the photograph for me because the underlying strength is there. And that's what the point I'm trying to make in this video is, if you more carefully examine the scenes that you are making pictures of when you're out on the street, or even, in documenting your own lives, that if you look a little more carefully at what's playing out in front of you, you may find that there's so much more that you can work with and play with in order to make an even better photograph than you may have anticipated initially. All right, I hope you found that helpful. As well as the Street Week here in LA in February, I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. in May and early June for Focus on the Story. It's another week-long event, but rather than focusing on street photography, it's largely focused on photojournalism and documentary photography, though I will be doing a 2-day workshop while I'm there. And if you want to sign up for that workshop or find out more about Focus on the Story, especially if the East Coast and Washington, D.C. is more accessible to you than Los Angeles, check it out by going focusonthestory.org. And if you've never heard of The Candid Frame is a podcast in which I feature conversations with photographers from all over the world, all genres, not just street photography. Our most recent conversation was with Valerie Jardin. She is a street photographer and a friend of the show. And we had a wonderful conversation, not so much about street photography, but a personal project that Valerie is working on where she photographs artists in their working space. And she's creating more of a series of environmental portraits. Beautiful work, and we really talk about the importance of a personal project, whether you're a professional, whether you're an amateur or an enthusiast, whatever way you define yourself. Working on a personal project, I think, is really critical for your growth. And I love the fact that we had the chance to discuss that. And it's something that I may discuss a little more on this channel in the near future, so stay tuned. And if you want to listen to this episode or find out more about the Candid Frame and everything that we do, go to thecandidframe.com. So thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.